I noticed the first sign of the stalker on a Tuesday morning, although at the time I had no reason to believe it was anything more than a coincidence. I was 26 and had been living alone in a small second-floor apartment for about 8 months. It was in an older building on the edge of town, the kind with narrow hallways, thin walls, and a parking lot that always seemed half empty even when most of the units were occupied. I worked at a dental office about 20 minutes away, usually leaving home around 7:30 every morning. My routine was painfully predictable. I stopped at the same gas station for coffee, took the same route to work, and usually got home sometime between 6 o'clock and 6:30 in the evening. Looking back, that routine was probably the worst thing about the situation. Anyone paying attention could have figured out exactly when I was coming and going. The first thing that bothered me was a car. It was a dark blue sedan parked across from the entrance to my building when I left for work that morning. I remember noticing it because it was facing the wrong direction for the parking spaces, with the driver's side angled toward the road. There was someone sitting inside, but I couldn't see their face because the windshield was reflecting the morning sun. I didn't think much of it. People waited in cars all the time. I got into mine and drove to work. That afternoon, around 5:45, I stopped at the same gas station on my way home. As I walked out carrying my coffee, I noticed the same dark blue sedan parked near the far end of the lot. I actually stopped for a second. It looked familiar, but I couldn't be sure. I told myself there were thousands of dark blue sedans in the city. I drove home. The car wasn't in my apartment parking lot. For the next several days, nothing happened. Then on Saturday night, I came home later than usual after having dinner with a coworker. It was close to midnight when I pulled into my parking space. I remember feeling relieved when I saw the building entrance was well lit. I grabbed my bag and started walking toward the door. That's when I heard someone behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of shoes scraping lightly against the pavement. I turned around and saw a man standing near the sidewalk. He was maybe 30 or 35, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. He wasn't doing anything suspicious. He wasn't approaching me. He was just standing there, looking in my direction. I stared at him for a moment, then looked away and entered the building. I didn't see him come inside. I took the stairs to my apartment and locked the door behind me. About 10 minutes later, I heard a sound outside my apartment. 3 slow knocks. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood in the middle of my living room and listened. Nothing. Then another 3 knocks. I walked toward the door but stopped before touching it. "Who is it?" I asked. No answer. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I waited another minute before checking again. Still nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. The following Monday, I told myself I was being paranoid. The incident had probably been a neighbor or someone at the wrong apartment. But when I got into my car before work, there was a folded piece of paper underneath my windshield wiper. I assumed it was a flyer until I pulled it off and unfolded it. There were 4 words written in black ink. "You should lock up." My stomach dropped. I looked around the parking lot. Nothing seemed unusual. No one was standing nearby. No one was sitting in a car. I crumpled the paper and threw it away, then drove to work. I spent most of the morning trying to convince myself it was some stupid prank. Maybe someone in the building had seen me leaving my door unlocked once. Maybe it was a warning from a neighbor. I even wondered if someone had found the note online as some kind of joke. But when I got home that evening, I checked my door before entering. The deadbolt was locked, but the handle had a tiny scratch around it that I hadn't noticed before. I couldn't remember whether it had always been there. I went inside and checked every window. Everything was locked. I called my older brother and told him what happened. He took me seriously, which made me feel better. He told me to photograph the note if I still had it and call the police if anything else happened. I didn't tell him how embarrassed I felt. The next morning, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. It said, "You looked tired last night." I stared at the screen for several seconds. I hadn't told anyone what time I'd gotten home. I immediately called my brother. He told me not to respond. Then he told me to call the police. I did. An officer came to my apartment about 40 minutes later. I showed him the messages, explained the note, and described the man I'd seen near the building. He asked whether I had any idea who might be doing it. I said no. He told me that without a direct threat or evidence identifying the person, there wasn't much they could do yet, but he advised me to change my routine, make sure my doors and windows were secured, and call immediately if the person appeared again. After he left, I changed my locks that afternoon. I also started parking in different spots whenever possible. For several days, nothing happened. I began to relax. Then, one Thursday evening, I was driving home when I noticed a dark blue sedan behind me. I wasn't certain it was the same one, but the shape was identical. I turned onto a side street. It followed. I turned again. It followed. My hands became sweaty on the steering wheel. I didn't want to drive straight home, so I kept going. After about 5 minutes, the sedan disappeared. I drove to a police station instead and waited in the parking lot for almost half an hour before finally going home. When I entered my apartment, everything looked normal. I checked the locks and went to bed early. Around 2:15 in the morning, I woke up because I heard something outside my bedroom window. My apartment was on the second floor, so hearing anything directly outside the window was unusual. I sat up and listened. There was a faint tapping sound against the glass. 3 taps. Then silence. 3 more. I got out of bed and slowly walked toward the window. I didn't turn on the light. I pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed a figure standing on the ground below. He was looking directly up at my window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could see the dark shape of his baseball cap. I backed away from the window and called the police. By the time officers arrived, he was gone. They searched around the building but couldn't find anyone. One officer checked the area beneath my window and found a cigarette still burning in the grass. It was fresh. He looked at me and asked, "Do you know if anyone has access to the building?" I said I didn't know. He told me to stay with someone else for a few nights if I could. My brother drove over and helped me pack a bag. I spent the next week at his house. I thought distance would solve the problem. It didn't. On the 3rd night, I was sitting on my brother's couch when my phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number appeared. "Nice house." I looked toward the front window. My brother lived in a quiet neighborhood with no sidewalks, and the curtains were closed. I showed him the message. He immediately called the police. Officers came, checked the property, and found nothing. My brother installed a camera over his front door the following morning. For the first few days, nothing appeared on it. Then, one night, I woke up around 3 a.m. because my phone had received a motion alert from the camera. I opened the app and watched the footage. A person was standing at the edge of my brother's driveway. He wasn't moving. He was just staring toward the house. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. I zoomed in on the video, but the image became blurry. I couldn't make out his face. Then he slowly turned away and walked out of view. My brother called the police again. This time, an officer took the footage and said they would investigate. I spent the next morning going through every message, every note, and every detail I could remember. That's when I noticed something I hadn't thought about before. Every time the stalker contacted me, he knew where I was. My apartment, my workplace, my brother's house. I hadn't posted any of those locations online. I hadn't told anyone about staying with my brother. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to figure out how he could possibly know. Then I remembered something from 2 weeks earlier. The day before the first note appeared, I had taken my car to a small repair shop because of a problem with the brakes. I had left the keys with the mechanic for several hours. I called the shop and asked whether anyone had been working around my car after it was repaired. The owner sounded confused. He checked their security footage and called me back. He said my car had been left outside overnight because they had finished the repair late. According to the footage, someone had walked around it at around 1 a.m. I asked him to describe the person. He said the person wore a baseball cap and dark jacket. Then he paused. There was something else, he said. The guy didn't seem interested in the car. He was looking through the driver's window. My blood ran cold. I asked him if he could send me the footage. He did. I watched it twice. The man walked around my car, leaned toward the driver's window, and stood there for several seconds. Then he reached toward the windshield and appeared to place something beneath the wiper. The camera angle was too far away to show his face. But when he walked away, I noticed the dark blue sedan parked across the street. I knew then that the car hadn't been following me by coincidence. Someone had been watching me long before I realized it. And when I finally understood that, I also realized something much worse. The stalker hadn't just been following my movements. He had been learning my routine. And the next morning, when I returned to my apartment with my brother beside me, there was a new note taped to my front door. This time it said only, "You weren't supposed to leave." The first thing I noticed was the package. It was sitting directly in front of my apartment door when I got home from work, a small brown cardboard box with my name handwritten across the top in black marker. There was no return address, and I hadn't ordered anything. I stood in the hallway staring at it for several seconds before unlocking my door. I lived in a third-floor apartment in a building that had about 40 units. And packages were normally left in a locked room near the lobby. Someone had carried this one upstairs and placed it directly outside my apartment. I didn't touch it. I went back downstairs and asked the property manager if she knew who had delivered it. She checked the building's camera system and told me no delivery driver had entered the building during the previous hour. I called the police and an officer came by. He put on gloves, opened the package carefully, and found nothing dangerous inside. There was an old paperback book, a cheap silver keychain, and a folded piece of paper. The note said, "I think you'd like this." There was no signature. The officer asked whether I recognized the handwriting. I didn't. I told him I had no idea who would leave something like that. He took the note and told me to keep the box in case they needed it later. I remember laughing nervously after he left because the whole thing felt ridiculous. It was creepy, but it still didn't feel real. That changed over the next 2 weeks. I started noticing small things that were difficult to explain. My bedroom curtains would be slightly open when I came home, even though I always closed them before leaving. One morning, my bathroom light was on. I thought I had forgotten to turn it off. Another evening, I found the chain lock on my front door hanging differently than I remembered. None of those things proved anything. I could have been forgetful. I could have been tired. I could have been imagining patterns where there weren't any. I tried to ignore it. Then someone started calling me from a blocked number. The first call came around 10:30 at night. I answered without thinking. There was silence on the other end. "Hello?" I said. Nothing. I hung up. A minute later, the phone rang again. Same thing. I didn't answer the third time. The calls continued almost every night. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 in a row, sometimes only one. I started keeping my phone on silent after 9 o'clock. I also stopped walking to my car alone. My coworker Melissa noticed the change and asked what was going on. I told her someone had been bothering me, but I didn't want to explain everything. She offered to walk me to my car after work. I accepted. For about a week, she came with me every evening. Then one Friday, she had to leave early. I told her I'd be fine. I regretted saying that almost immediately. I walked through the parking lot and noticed a man standing beside a parked car near the entrance. He was facing away from me. I couldn't see his face. I kept walking. When I reached my car, I heard him say my name. Not loudly, just enough for me to hear. I turned around. He was still standing near the other car. "Do I know you?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just smiled slightly. I got inside my car, locked the doors, and drove away. I didn't go home. I drove to a shopping center and parked in front of a busy restaurant. I sat there for 20 minutes before calling Melissa. She told me to call the police. I did. An officer met me at the restaurant and took my statement. He asked if the man had followed me. I said I didn't know. He advised me to stop driving directly home from work for a while and to keep a record of every incident. I started doing that. I wrote down dates, times, locations, phone calls, strange noises, everything. For a while, the incidents seemed to stop. I began to think maybe the person had lost interest. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I went grocery shopping. When I returned, I found a photograph tucked under my windshield wiper. It was a picture of me sitting in my car. I recognized the clothes I was wearing. The picture had been taken from across the parking lot only a few hours earlier. On the back, someone had written, "You look happier when you don't know I'm watching." I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. I called the police immediately. An officer arrived and looked at the photograph. He asked whether I had any idea where it had been taken. I pointed across the street. There was a row of businesses with large windows overlooking the parking lot. He checked the area but couldn't identify anyone. The officer told me something that stuck with me. If this person is getting close enough to photograph you, you need to assume they're watching you more often than you realize. I went home that evening and barely slept. The next day I asked my landlord whether the building had cameras covering the parking lot. She said there was one near the main entrance, but it didn't cover the entire lot. I asked if anyone had reported suspicious behavior. She hesitated before answering. Then she told me another tenant had complained about someone entering the building late at night. She said the complaints were never specific enough to identify anyone. That night I put a chair underneath my apartment door handle. I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined to get inside, but it made me feel better. Around 1:40 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door. I sat upright in bed. There was a faint sound of someone breathing on the other side. I didn't move. Then I heard 3 soft knocks. I grabbed my phone and called the police. While I was speaking quietly to the dispatcher, the person outside tried the handle, Once, twice, then the footsteps moved away. I stayed on the phone until the officer arrived. He checked the hallway, stairs, and elevator. Nobody was there. The building's camera showed a person entering the hallway, but the camera angle only captured their back. They wore a hooded sweatshirt and dark pants. The officer told me they would try to obtain a clearer copy of the footage. I spent the next few nights at my sister's house. I didn't tell many people what was happening because I was embarrassed and afraid people would think I was exaggerating. My sister didn't make me feel that way. She told me I could stay as long as I needed. One evening, while we were watching television, I received another call from the blocked number. I answered because I wanted to hear something, anything. For several seconds, there was silence. Then a man's voice said, "You should stop telling people about me." The call ended. One immediately showed my sister. She called the police. This time, they treated it as a direct threat. They asked me to provide every piece of evidence I had. I gave them the photographs, messages, notes, call records, and the security footage from my apartment building. A detective later told me they were trying to determine whether the incidents were connected to someone I knew. They asked about former relationships, co-workers, neighbors, and anyone who might have had access to my personal information. I couldn't think of anyone. Then the detective asked me about my apartment keys. I told him I had never lost them. He asked whether anyone else had ever had a copy. I thought for a moment and remembered that when I first moved in, the property manager had given me 2 keys. One was mine. The other was supposed to stay with the building. I asked her about it. She looked through the records and said there was only 1 spare key listed. She couldn't remember who had made it. A few days later, the detective called me and asked me to come to the station. They had found something. Someone had been using a key to enter the building after midnight. The camera footage showed the same person appearing repeatedly over several weeks. They never used the elevator. They always took the stairs. The detective couldn't identify the person's face, but he showed me a still image. I recognized the jacket immediately. It belonged to the maintenance worker who had been fixing a leaking pipe in my apartment months earlier. I felt sick. I had let him inside my home. He had been alone there for almost an hour while I was at work. The detective told me they were investigating him, but they needed more evidence before confronting him. I went back to my apartment that afternoon with a police escort and changed the locks. I also installed a small camera inside my living room facing the front door. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. On the 3rd night, I received an alert at 2:16 a.m. I opened the camera app and watched the footage. The front door was still locked. Nobody was visible. Then the camera detected movement again. I watched the image carefully. A shadow appeared beneath the door. Someone was standing in the hallway. I called the police. While I waited, the shadow disappeared. The person had walked away. When officers arrived, they searched the building but found no one. The next morning, the detective called and told me the maintenance worker had been questioned. He denied everything. There wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. I felt trapped. That afternoon, I went to work as usual. Around noon, Melissa came into my office holding an envelope. She said it had been left at the front desk for me. Inside was another photograph. This one showed me standing beside my sister's house. The picture had clearly been taken from across the street. On the back were 6 words, "I know where you sleep now." I stared at it until the room around me seemed to disappear. Then my phone rang. It was my sister. She was crying. I asked what happened. She said she had just found something outside her bedroom window. I drove there with the police following behind me. When I arrived, my sister was standing on the porch. She pointed toward the side yard. There, pressed into the wet soil beneath her bedroom window, was a single clear footprint. Beside it was a cigarette butt. The police photographed everything. Then one of the officers walked around the side of the house and stopped. He looked back at us with a strange expression. "You need to come see this," he said. On the ground beneath the window was a small object wrapped in plastic. It was a key. Not my sister's house key. It was the spare key to my old apartment, the one I had given back to the property manager months earlier. I had only been living in the house for 3 months when I started noticing the same truck. It was an old white pickup with a dented front bumper and a dark toll box mounted behind the cab. The first time I saw it, I was leaving work around 6:15 in the evening. It was parked across the street from the office, facing the opposite direction from traffic. I remember the truck because I had almost backed into it while pulling out of my parking space. There was a man sitting behind the wheel, but he looked down at his phone when I glanced toward him. I didn't think much of it. I drove home, made dinner, watched television, and went to bed. The next evening I saw the same truck near a coffee shop I stopped at on my way home. I recognized the dent on the bumper. Again, I told myself it was probably nothing. I lived in a small town where people drove the same routes every day. Seeing the same vehicle twice wasn't strange. A week later, I saw it outside the grocery store. This time I started paying attention. The truck was parked several spaces away from mine. The man inside wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking directly at me. I got into my car and locked the doors. When I started the engine, the truck pulled out. I waited several minutes before leaving. It didn't follow me. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. I mentioned it to my friend Daniel, who told me to write down the license plate if I saw it again. The next time I saw the truck, I did. I wrote the plate number in my phone. I didn't know what I expected to happen. Nothing happened for several days. Then one Saturday morning, I found my mailbox open. I assumed the mail carrier had left it that way, but when I checked inside, one of my envelopes had been opened. It was a bank statement. Nothing had been taken. Whoever opened it had simply looked inside and put it back. I called the post office and asked whether they had delivered anything unusual. They said no. I called the police and explained what happened. An officer came by and checked the mailbox. There wasn't much they could do because there was no evidence identifying whoever had opened it. He suggested I switch to paperless billing and install a camera near the front of the house. I did both. For the next week, I tried to forget about it. Then I started receiving phone calls from a number I didn't recognize. Unlike the previous stories I'd heard from other people, the caller never threatened me. He would simply ask questions. "Are you home? Did you go to work today? Did you sleep well?" The first time I hung up. The second time I asked who he was. He laughed quietly and said, "You already know?" I blocked the number. Another one appeared the next day. I blocked that too. Then came the messages. "Nice curtains. Your porch light is broken. You should close the garage." I stopped using my garage and started parking on the street instead. I also began checking the camera before stepping outside. Most nights, nothing appeared. Then one night, around 11:30, the camera showed a person walking slowly past my house. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans. His face wasn't visible. He walked past the driveway, stopped near the mailbox, and looked directly toward the camera. Then he continued down the street. I called the police and showed them the footage. They told me to save everything and call if the person returned. I asked whether they could identify him. They said the video quality wasn't good enough. The next morning, I found a small envelope attached to my front door. Inside was a printed photograph of my house. The picture had been taken from across the street. Someone had circled my bedroom window in red ink. I didn't go to work that day. I sat in my living room with every curtain closed and waited for the police. An officer took the photograph and asked if I had any idea who might be doing this. I said no. He asked whether I had recently argued with anyone, ended a relationship, rejected someone, or had problems with a neighbor. I thought about it. There was one person who came to mind. His name was Eric. He had worked at my company until 6 months earlier. We had never dated, but he had asked me out several times. I had politely refused. Eventually, he stopped asking. When I mentioned his name, the officer wrote it down. He asked whether Eric knew where I lived. I said probably. My office had my address on file for employment records, and Eric had worked in the same department. The officer told me they would look into him. 2 days later, I received a message from an unknown number. I heard you were talking about me. I stared at the screen. I hadn't told anyone except the police. I called Daniel and asked whether he had mentioned Eric. He said no. I didn't understand how the person knew. That evening, I went to the police station and gave them the message. A detective told me they had contacted Eric. He denied being involved and said he hadn't spoken to me in months. They checked his vehicle. He drove a black SUV, not a white pickup. He also had an alibi for several of the incidents. The detective told me they couldn't connect him to the stalking. I went home feeling more confused than before. If it wasn't Eric, then who was it? The answer came several days later, but not in the way I expected. I had just gotten home from work when I noticed the white pickup parked at the end of my street. I immediately took a picture of the license plate and called the police. While I was waiting, the truck started moving. It drove slowly past my house and stopped directly across from my driveway. I stayed inside my locked car. The driver's window lowered. The man behind the wheel looked at me. I recognized him from the previous sightings. He was older than I had imagined, probably in his late 40s. He didn't look angry. He looked completely calm. He raised one hand and waved. Then he drove away. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They ran the plate and told me the truck was registered to a man named Robert. They asked if I knew him. I said no. They told me they would try to locate him. The following day, they contacted me. Robert had a criminal record for several unrelated offenses, but nothing directly connected to stalking. He claimed he had never seen me before. He said he had been driving through the neighborhood because his sister lived nearby. The police couldn't prove otherwise. I felt helpless. I started changing my routine constantly. I took different roads to work, stopped going to the same stores, and avoided being alone. I told my boss what was happening, and the company allowed me to park inside a secured area. For a while, that seemed to help. Then the stalker found another way to reach me. One afternoon, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "You forgot something." Attached was a picture of me sitting at my desk at work. I was wearing the same clothes I had on that day. The photo had been taken through the glass wall of my office. I immediately stood up and looked outside. The hallway was empty. I called security. They searched the building and checked access logs. No one unauthorized had entered. I couldn't understand how someone had taken the picture. That night I stayed with Daniel. Around 2 a.m., his doorbell camera detected movement. We opened the footage and saw the white pickup parked across the street. Robert had found me again. Daniel called the police while I watched the camera feed. The truck remained there for nearly 15 minutes. Then the driver stepped out. He walked toward Daniel's house. I could see him approaching the front gate. I felt my entire body tense. He stopped at the gate and looked directly at the camera. Then he placed something on the ground and walked away. Police arrived minutes later, but he was gone. The object was a small plastic bag containing a photograph. It showed me standing in my own bedroom. I recognized the pajamas I was wearing. I knew when the picture had been taken because I remembered that exact night. It had been nearly a month earlier. I had been asleep. The detective stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then he asked me a question that made my stomach turn. "Has anyone ever had a key to your house?" I told him the landlord had one. He asked whether anyone else had ever entered while I wasn't home. I thought about it and remembered something. A month before the stalking began, I had hired a local handyman to repair a broken window in my bedroom. He had spent about 40 minutes inside while I was at work. I gave the detective his name. The police contacted him. He had no connection to Robert and no criminal record. They checked his phone records and found nothing. The detective told me they couldn't determine how the photograph had been taken. I began sleeping with a chair against my bedroom door. I kept lights on all night. I stopped answering unknown calls. I stopped posting online. I even deleted most of my social media accounts. Still, the stalker seemed to know where I was. Then, one evening, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. "You're making this difficult." I didn't respond. Another message came 30 seconds later. "So I'm coming closer." I called the police immediately. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, my motion camera sent an alert. Someone was standing in my backyard. I opened the camera feed. The image showed a man near the bedroom window. He wasn't wearing the hoodie from the earlier footage. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. He looked up toward the camera. Then he stepped closer to the window. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door. I could hear something outside. A faint scrape against the glass. I whispered to the dispatcher that someone was at the window. Then the sound stopped. I heard footsteps moving across the yard. The police arrived less than 5 minutes later. They searched the property but found nobody. There were fresh footprints in the soil beneath the window. They followed them to the side gate. The gate was unlocked. One officer noticed something caught on the fence. It was a small piece of black fabric. They bagged it as evidence. The next morning, detectives called me and told me they had finally identified the person in the footage. It wasn't Robert. It wasn't Eric. It wasn't the handyman. The person was someone I had never considered because I had seen him almost every day. He was the security guard at my workplace. His name was Mark. He had access to the parking lot cameras, knew my work schedule, knew when I arrived and left, and had access to employee information. He had also been the person who took my picture through the glass wall. Police searched his apartment and found hundreds of photographs of me, maps of my routes, printed copies of my work schedule, and notes about places I regularly visited. There was even a notebook containing dates and times when I had left my house. Mark was arrested. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I moved to another town shortly afterward and changed my phone number. The police told me Mark had admitted following me, but denied taking the photograph of me sleeping. They never found evidence proving how that particular photograph had been taken. I tried not to think about it. About 6 months later, I received a letter from the detective handling my case. Mark had been convicted on several charges related to stalking and unlawful surveillance. The detective said they had found additional evidence during the investigation. He also mentioned something that I still think about whenever I wake up during the night. The night before Mark was arrested, someone had entered my backyard and stood beneath my bedroom window. The camera footage showed the person clearly enough to confirm it wasn't Mark. The detective couldn't identify who it was. There was no vehicle visible, no usable fingerprint, and no obvious connection to Mark. I asked him whether they believed Mark had an accomplice. He said they had considered it but never found proof. I asked what the person had been doing outside my window. He hesitated before answering. "Just standing there," he said, "looking up at your bedroom."